6 years. Not one penny. Not one word of thanks. And the day he walked through that door and looked at those account books, the books I had been writing by hand every single quarter for 6 years, he asked me one question that nobody had ever thought to ask before. Were you paid for this? Elizabeth Holt had kept Harlow House running. She had managed the money, tracked every debt, filed every letter from Italy, and made sure nothing fell apart. She did all of it quietly. She did all of it alone. And she did all of it for free. Now there was a new duke, and he wanted answers. But so did she. Because the moment he asked that question, Elizabeth realized something. She was not just a widow living on borrowed time in someone else's house. She was the only person who knew the truth about Harlow, its money, its land, its secrets buried in 6 years of carefully kept records. The question was simple. What was she going to do with that? Rafe Mwanga Cavendish did not arrive at Harlow House making demands. He arrived quietly. He walked into the library. He sat down, and he opened the account books. Now, to understand who Rafe was, you need to understand something about England in 1817. When a man of high rank had a child outside of marriage, that child had no legal rights, no title, no inheritance, nothing. But the late Duke of Harlow had done something unusual. Years before his death, he had gone to Parliament and put it in writing. He formally acknowledged Rafe as his son. Parliament passed an act that made it legal. On paper, Rafe was the rightful Duke of Harlow. But England in 1817 did not always care about what was on paper. The law said one thing. Society said another. People who had known the old Duke for decades looked at Rafe and chose not to see a Duke. They saw a problem. They saw someone who did not fit the world they were used to. And they made that clear, not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with silence. Cold rooms, turned backs, invitations that never came. Rafe had spent his entire adult life watching this happen. So he had learned to say very little and observe everything. That was how he noticed Elizabeth. She was standing near the door of the library, still, waiting to be dismissed, the way a person waits when they have learned that patience is safer than presence. He looked at the account books in his hands. Then he looked at her. "These are not written in my father's hand," he said. "No, Your Grace. They are written in mine." He turned another page. The numbers were exact. The records went back 6 years. Every quarter, every expense, every letter from the estate agent in Florence, Italy. All of it, written clearly, maintained carefully, without a single gap. He asked her the question that would change everything. "Were you paid for this?" Silence. That silence was her answer. Here is something important. In Regency, England, this was not unusual. Women ran households, managed land, supervised staff, kept financial records and handled correspondence on behalf of estates worth thousands of pounds. But almost none of them were given a formal title for doing it. Almost none were paid a salary. And almost none were protected by any legal document that said, "This is her work, and she is owed something for it." They did the work. The world took the work. And nobody called it wrong. This is what historians now recognize as one of the quiet injustices of the period. Not violence, not cruelty, just a system that made women invisible and called it normal. Now here's your red flag for today, and this one matters. When someone does skilled, necessary work, and the people around them benefit from that work, but nobody names it, nobody pays for it, and nobody asks whether it is fair, that is not an accident. That is a pattern. It does not always come from a bad person. It can come from a system, a habit, or simply from nobody ever stopping to ask the question. Rafe stopped. He asked. The second man in this story had not yet asked anything, but he was already working. Edmund Ashworth, the Duke of Alverton, arrived at Harlow as co-trustee, a role appointed by the courts to oversee the estate during the change of ownership. A co-trustee in 1817 was a legal guardian of sorts for the property, not the owner, but responsible for making sure everything was handled correctly until the full transfer was complete. Alverton did not arrive to make friends. He arrived to solve problems. That was simply who he was. Before you had finished telling him something was broken, he was already fixing it. He spoke in careful sentences. He listened with the particular attention of a man who was always, quietly, several steps ahead. He walked into the library that first morning and said 4 words. "The solicitor is coming." The solicitor arrived from London 3 days later. His name was Mr. Fitch. He was a small, careful man who carried bad news the way most people carry heavy bags, with both hands and a tight expression. He sat down across from Rafe and Alverton and placed a document on the table. The document had the late Duke's signature on it, and it stated, in the formal legal language of the time, that a parcel of land belonging to the Harlow estate, specifically, a property in Tuscany, Italy, that had been in the family for decades, had been transferred to a distant cousin by the name of Frederick Peel. Rafe read it once, then again. Alverton said nothing. He simply picked it up, read it, and set it back down with the particular stillness of a man deciding what to do next. The problem was not just the document itself. The problem was what it meant for Harlow. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to know about something called the entailment. In 1817 England, land was not simply owned the way we think of ownership today. It was controlled by a legal system that decided, in advance, who could receive it and under what conditions. An entailment was essentially a set of rules attached to a property, rules that determined who inherited, who could sell, and who had any claim at all. This system was designed to keep estates intact and within family lines. But it also meant that one document, signed at the wrong moment, witnessed poorly, or pushed through when a man was not thinking clearly, could hand a piece of an estate to someone with almost no connection to it. Frederick Peel was that someone. He was a distant relation. He had not grown up at Harlow. He had no meaningful connection to the estate or the people on it. But he had a document with a signature on it, and he had taken it to the courts in Florence the moment he heard the old Duke had died. And here is the historical reality behind this. After the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, property records across Europe were in disorder. Borders had shifted. Courts had changed hands. Documents that should have been registered properly had been delayed, lost or never filed at all. British families who held land in Italy, Spain, or Germany found themselves in exactly this kind of dispute. A distant relative would appear with a piece of paper, and the burden fell on the estate to prove the paper was wrong. Rafe and Alverton had 2 weeks to build their case before the matter went back to the London courts. They worked from opposite ends of the library table. Alverton drafted legal arguments. Rafe wrote to the estate agent in Florence, asking for records. Both men were thorough. Both men were capable. And both men were missing the most important thing. They did not know that Elizabeth already had it. She had not said anything yet. She sat with that knowledge for a full day. She turned it over carefully, the way you handle something that could either help you or harm you depending on which way you hold it. Because here is what she understood that they did not. She had 6 years of letters from the Florence estate agent. She had 6 years of quarterly accounts showing the Tuscany property had never once been treated as belonging to anyone other than Harlow. She had the whole picture, filed neatly, in her own handwriting. Frederick Peel's document could not survive that evidence. She knew it. The question was not whether she had what was needed. The question was what it would cost her to hand it over. In 1817, a woman who stepped forward, who made herself visible in a legal matter, who put her name on official records, did not always come out of it safely. Visibility, for a woman in that era, carried risk. And Elizabeth had spent 6 years learning to stay exactly invisible enough to remain useful. She was about to make a different choice. It started with a letter, not from Elizabeth, about her. Frederick Peel's solicitor had been doing his own work quietly. He had found out that the Harlow accounts were not written by the late Duke. He had found out they were written by a widow living inside the house, a woman with no formal appointment, no salary, and no legal document that said she had any official role at all. And he used that. He wrote to the London court and suggested that any records produced by Elizabeth Holt should be treated with caution. His argument was simple and deliberate. She was not an employee. She was not an official administrator. She was a woman living on the goodwill of the estate, which meant she had a personal interest in how the case turned out. And a person with a personal interest, he argued, could not be considered a reliable source. He did not need to prove she had done anything wrong. He only needed to plant the doubt. This is where you need to understand something about how England worked in 1817. A woman's reputation was one of the only things she truly possessed. Not money, not property, not legal rights. Reputation. And that reputation could be damaged without a single fact being proven. All it took was a suggestion, a question raised in the right room, a letter written in careful legal language that made people wonder. This was not accidental. It was a tool, and it was used regularly, not always by cruel people, but by people who needed someone removed from a situation and found that a woman's credibility was the easiest thing to attack. Elizabeth read the letter that evening. She sat with it for a long time. She was not afraid. She was thinking. The next morning she went to find Alverton. Not Rafe. Alverton. Because she did not need comfort. She needed a document. She found him in the library, already at the table, already working. "I need you to draw something up," she said. "A formal appointment, backdated to the date I first opened these account books. It needs to state clearly that I was acting as a state administrator in an official capacity, not as a dependent of the household, as an appointed officer of the estate." Alverton looked at her steadily. "That document will put your name into the court record directly. It will not remove the risk to your reputation. It may increase it." "I know," Elizabeth said, "but it will make the records harder to dismiss. Right now they can call my work personal. If there is a formal appointment on record, they cannot. The evidence becomes official. The estate keeps the land." He was quiet for a moment. "You are making yourself more visible," he said, "in order to protect something that does not belong to you." "It belongs to Harlow," she said, "and the people on this estate have had enough taken from them already." He drafted the document that same afternoon. That evening, Rafe read it. He set it down on the table. He looked at Elizabeth with the particular expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood sooner. Then he asked her a question. Not the question she expected. Not, "Are you certain about this?" Not, "Do you understand the risk?" He asked her something nobody had asked her in years. "What is it that you want, Mrs. Holt? Not what Harlow needs. Not what the court requires. What do you want?" Elizabeth opened her mouth, and for the first time in 6 years, she did not have a careful answer ready. "Here is your red flag for today. There is a difference between being needed and being valued." Elizabeth had been needed for 6 years. The house needed her records. The estate needed her letters. Everyone needed her work. But not one person had asked what she needed in return. Being needed keeps you busy. Being valued means someone sees the cost of what you are giving and believes you deserve something back. Elizabeth had spent 6 years believing that being useful was enough. That if she kept her head down, kept the books clean, caused no trouble and asked for nothing, she would be safe. She was wrong. Not because the people around her were cruel, but because a system that does not ask what you want does not protect you. It simply uses you, quietly, politely, and for as long as you allow it. The moment Rafe asked that question, everything shifted, because Elizabeth finally had an answer. Elizabeth answered Rafe's question that night. She sat across from him at the library table and she spoke plainly, without apology, for the first time in 6 years. She did not ask for much. A written contract that confirmed her role as a state administrator. A fair yearly income in exchange for the work she had already been doing. And a small property. Somewhere modest. Somewhere that belonged to her by document, not by permission. Not charity. A fair exchange for work already done. Rafe listened without interrupting. Alverton, who had come in quietly partway through, listened too. When she finished, neither man spoke immediately. Not because they were reluctant, but because both of them were, in their own way, absorbing the fact that nobody had ever simply asked her before. Alverton picked up his pen. 2 weeks later, Rafe and Alverton traveled to London. They brought everything. 6 years of quarterly accounts. Every letter from the Florence estate agent. The formal document of appointment, properly witnessed and dated. All of it, laid out clearly, in order, without gaps. Frederick Peel's solicitor made his arguments. He questioned Elizabeth's role. He raised his doubts. He used every careful phrase available to him to suggest that the records were not reliable. The court asked one question in return. Could he produce any evidence that contradicted them? He could not. The cousins' claim failed. The Tuscany property remained part of the Harlow estate. And when the court clerk wrote up the official record of the proceedings, he included a name he had not been given by either duke. Elizabeth Holt, estate administrator, Harlow House, Shropshire. For the first time in 6 years, her name was on an official document, not as a dependent, not as a widow, as the person responsible for the work. Now here is something important, and it connects directly to real history. Women who managed estates in the Regency period were not rare. What was rare was recognition. The vast majority of women who kept accounts, managed correspondence, and ran households for large estates did so without any formal record of their contribution. When the estate changed hands, their work was absorbed into the new ownership and their names disappeared entirely. The women who did receive formal recognition, a written appointment, a salary, a legal acknowledgement of their role, almost always had to fight for it, not with arguments or raised voices, with patience, precision, and the willingness to make themselves visible at a moment when staying invisible felt safer. That is exactly what Elizabeth did. 3 weeks after the London hearing, a sealed letter arrived at Harlow House addressed to Mrs. Elizabeth Holt. Inside was a document, drafted by Alverton, signed by Rafe, witnessed by Mr. Fitch, the solicitor, who had by this point developed a quiet and genuine respect for all three of them. The document granted Elizabeth the use of a modest property in Worcestershire, held in her name, not borrowed, not permitted, hers. It confirmed a formal yearly income, paid quarterly, in recognition of her continuing role as a state administrator. And it included a clause that Alverton had added without being asked, which stated that the arrangement could only be ended by mutual agreement in writing. He had closed the door through which she could be quietly removed. Elizabeth read the document once. She set it down on the table. She looked out of the window at the October light coming through the glass. She did not celebrate. She did not feel triumph. What she felt was quieter than that. It was the feeling of putting down something heavy that you have been carrying for so long you stopped noticing the weight. It moved through her slowly, and it came out as tears, not from sadness, not from relief exactly, but from the particular sensation of being, for the first time in years, genuinely safe. She had not been rescued. No one had stepped in to save her. She had seen what was needed. She had named what she wanted. And she had been willing to stand in the open long enough for it to matter. That was what had changed everything. The lesson here is this: sacrifice does not always mean loss. Elizabeth gave up the invisibility she had built carefully over 6 years. That invisibility had felt like protection, but it was not protecting her. It was simply keeping her small. When she let it go, When she stepped forward and put her name on the record, she did not lose anything worth keeping. She gained everything worth having. There is something this story asks you to carry with you after it ends. Your work has value whether or not someone has named it, whether or not someone has thanked you for it, whether or not there is a document somewhere that says you are owed something in return. The value was always there. Elizabeth's records did not become important the day the court saw them. They were important every single day she wrote them. The court simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise. If you are in a situation where your contribution goes unnoticed, where you are doing real, necessary work and nobody is asking whether it is fair, you are allowed to name it. You are not being difficult. You are not asking for too much. You are doing what Elizabeth did. You are simply telling the truth about what your work is worth. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Now, Elizabeth's story is settled. She has her contract. She has her property in Worcestershire. She has her name on a court record that nobody can remove. For the first time in 6 years, she is not waiting for someone to decide whether she can stay. She has already decided. But there are 2 men still standing in the library at Harlow House. Rafe and Alverton. The case is closed. The solicitor has gone back to London. The estate is secure. There is nothing left to manage, nothing left to fix. No problem sitting on the table between them waiting to be solved. Just 2 men, in a room, with nothing left to do except face the thing neither of them has named yet. Because here is what Elizabeth had noticed, long before either of them had the courage to notice it themselves. These were 2 men who had spent their entire lives being useful, solving things, carrying things, showing up for other people's problems with both hands ready. But the moment the work stopped, something else was still there. Something that had been growing quietly in the background of every conversation, every late evening at that library table. Every moment one of them said something and the other one understood it without needing it explained. Neither of them had asked themselves what they wanted. Not really. Not in the way that Elizabeth had finally learned to ask. That question, Rafe's question, the one he had asked her that changed her life, was now sitting between the 2 of them, unanswered. What do you want? Not what does the estate need? Not what does duty require? What do you want, for yourself, when everything else has been taken care of? That is the question this story leaves open. Deliberately. Because some stories do not end. They simply reach the point where the most important part is about to begin. What happens next between these 2 men? That is a story for another day. And if you want to be here when it is told, you know what to do. This channel is built on storytelling. Every story you watch here is a work of fiction. The characters are not real people. The events did not happen, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is entirely coincidental. Where historical facts, cultural context, and real-world information are included, they are presented for educational purposes only. Our goal is simple: to tell stories that entertain, educate, and leave you with something worth thinking about long after the video ends. If this story stayed with you, if Elizabeth's courage meant something to you, if you found yourself thinking about the work you do and whether it is being seen, then subscribe to this channel. Click the button. Turn on the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. This community is built for people who love stories that teach something real. Stories that are set in the past but speak directly to the present. Stories where the most powerful moment is not a grand gesture. It is a quiet person finally deciding they have been silent long enough. There are more stories coming. More moments like this one. More characters who will make you think, make you feel, and leave you with something worth holding on to. Do not miss them. Subscribe now, and we will see you in the next one. I created this story because we often forget that behind the polished halls and sealed legal documents of 1817, there were real people quietly holding everything together and receiving nothing in return. This narrative was inspired by the real property disputes that followed the Napoleonic Wars across Europe and the silent injustices built into Regency England's legal system. During this period, a woman could run an entire estate, manage thousands of pounds, and keep a household from falling apart, and still have no legal existence inside the very walls she maintained. I wanted to explore Elizabeth not as a background character, but as a woman caught inside one of history's quietest traps, essential and invisible at the same time. It makes me wonder, how long can a person remain useful to a world that refuses to name what they are worth? This story is a tribute to the people history forgot to write down properly, the ones who kept everything running while the world argued about who deserved the credit. True strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply a person who finally decides their name deserves to be on the page too.